Today's lesson is looking at the composition of blood, and our learning intention is to identify the components of blood. So the average person has about 5 litres of blood based on weight. Of that 5 litres, about 55% is liquid that we call plasma, and about 45% are the cellular components. So the cells that make up blood include red blood cells or erythrocytes. You've got your white blood cells, which you guys should know quite well by now, your leukocytes. And we also have cell fragments called platelets, which are involved in clotting of blood, which we'll look at in a second. So if you have a look at this volume of blood here, if that's been centrifuged to isolate its components, you'll see that this yellowy looking substance here, this clearish fluid, that's the plasma. That's the liquid portion of it, which makes up just over half of the blood. And this middle layer in between the plasma and the red blood cells, that's the white blood cells and platelets. And at the bottom here, you have the red blood cells, which make up by far the major component here of the cellular components, which would be this section down here. So blood is actually a fluid connective tissue. It does lack fibers, which makes it more fluid. And you'd think a connective tissue like a ligament or a tendon would be full of those fibers. Blood doesn't have them. However, it does connect different organs. So it connects organs at the same time. It also acts as a barrier to some substances. So technically, we can call it a connective tissue. Here again, you can see the components of the blood laid out. You've got your white blood cells up here, which are slightly larger than your red blood cells. The plasma, which again is this clearish fluid at the top here. And then you've got your platelets. So these are the small fragments of cells that help with blood clotting. And of course, you just got your red blood cells in here as well, your erythrocytes. So let's talk about the function of blood. One function is to carry oxygen. It also carries nutrients such as glucose. So both of these, obviously vital for respiration. It also carries ions. So you could have sodium, calcium, for instance, maybe potassium as well. And these are used for structure, for setting up osmotic gradients as well. So it carries these substances to our cells, also carrying waste. So waste like CO2 can be carried away from cells, which is a byproduct there of respiration, and then it can be excreted. Also plays a vital role in the immune system. So white blood cells are carried by the blood. If you think back to the second line of defense, neutrophils and macrophages are carried via the blood to the site of the infection so they can start taking care of any pathogens. So we'll talk a little bit about the oxygen being carried by the blood, and we can see here we're zoomed in our lungs, one of the small little sacs at the end of the branches in your lungs, the alveoli. Well, this is a single alveolus, and wrapping around the outside here we have a capillary carrying the red blood cells from the heart and back to the heart. So we've got a red blood cell entering here, and it's at this point here the blood is low. It's low in O2 and high in CO2. And via diffusion, the CO2 will diffuse across those membranes into the alveolus, and when we breathe out, it's actually exhaled. Now, if you look at the other side here, we're breathing in oxygen, obviously, and at this point here, we still have low O2. We have a high concentration of O2 in the alveolus itself, and via diffusion, again, that O2 will travel across the membrane and into the red blood cell to be taken back to the heart via that capillary and pumped around the body. This here is our kidney. Kidneys, they filter about 200 litres of blood per day. So it filters all of your blood in your body about 40 times per day. So it filters 200 litres of blood per day, and it's filtering out of your blood any toxins or wastes that need to be excreted. Lots of capillaries in here, lots of blood flow in order to get that amount of blood filtered per day. And over here, we can just see our intestines, and what we're looking at here is out of the intestines, the food that we're digesting, that some of the nutrients, such as glucose, that we've already mentioned over here, would be absorbed into the bloodstream and carried to the cells as well via the blood. So let's have a look at the plasma in a little bit more detail. So plasma is the straw-colored liquid that carries the cells and the platelets here, which help the blood clot. So the platelets are helping the blood clot. Plasma composition is about 92% water and about 7% proteins, which include enzymes, hormones, your antibodies from your third line of defense, pH buffers, fibrinogen, which is another substance that helps with clotting. We'll look at that in a second. Other substances that are included in your plasma include, as we've already spoken about, nutrients such as glucose that you've picked up via the intestines. You'll have vitamins and minerals. Waste minerals, so CO2 and urea that need to be excreted, will be carried in the plasma itself. And ions such as potassium and calcium, which we've also mentioned before. So carbon dioxide can actually travel in the plasma itself. It's more soluble than oxygen. So oxygen, as we'll see in a second, actually needs help being carried through the blood. CO2 is quite happy to dissolve in the plasma itself before it gets excreted. Okay, the red blood cells or erythrocytes. The function is to transport oxygen from lungs to body cells. And any guesses as to why that is? Cellular respiration. All of your cells require oxygen in order to undergo respiration in the mitochondria. They're biconcave, disc shaped. So you can see you have this biconcave kind of shape here. It's almost like a donut that doesn't have the hole punched out of the center. This increases surface area to volume to make the uptake of oxygen more efficient. They're highly flexible, so they can fit through capillaries. They lack a nucleus, so they can fit more hemoglobin in. They contain hemoglobin, so this is the protein that actually carries the oxygen. They have a lifespan of about 120 days before they're recycled. Males actually have about 45% of their blood as erythrocytes compared to females, which is about 40%. Now, this is just due to differences in hormone levels, which affect the production of hemoglobin in the bone marrow. So it's actually higher in males when compared to females. So the last blood cell we'll talk about before we move on to platelets are your white blood cells or leukocytes. I'm pretty sure you guys are fairly comfortable in understanding the role of white blood cells after the last couple of weeks in class, but we'll go through these anyway. We've got the function is in immunity and defense against disease. Most have a nucleus and are slightly larger than red blood cells, but are far fewer. So the background we have here, this image, is a blood smear on a light microscope slide, and I'm just pointing out here these larger leukocytes there, and you can actually see they're larger than the surrounding smaller erythrocytes or red blood cells. So they're larger, and you can also see quite easily that there's just less of them. So they are slightly larger, but far fewer. Just under half of them would be phagocytes. So they undergo phagocytosis and engulf foreign bacteria and dead cells. The rest would be made up of lymphocytes. So these are your B and T lymphocytes that produce antibodies if you're a B plasma cell and develop immune responses. So remember our two lymphocytes down here. B lymphocyte, we're producing antibodies if that's extracellular infection. If we have infected cells, we have the cell-mediated response by the T lymphocytes. And then over here we have some different types of white blood cells. We've got our neutrophils, which are the basically what pus is made from, dead neutrophils. Some basophils in here, monocytes, which will eventually become phagocytes themselves. The last component of blood we're going to look at are platelets. So platelets are not true cells. They're only fragments of cells. These are the platelets here in this image. You can see them floating along in the bloodstream. You've got some erythrocytes here as well. They're much smaller than the red blood cells and the white blood cells, and their function is blood clotting to prevent blood loss. The way they do this is the platelets will gather at the site of an injury and stick to the edges of the wound. They release chemicals, which is a pretty complex process that helps start the process of blood clotting to stop any bleeding and eventually form a scab. Over here, you can all of these strands you see through here are what we call fibrin. And the platelets help produce this fibrin fibers from the fibrinogen that we spoke about earlier a couple of slides ago, which is carried through the plasma. So these will bind together red blood cells. If there's a wound or a cut that needs to be sealed, they'll actually bind that up and eventually form a scab. So the last thing we're going to look at today is how blood clotting prevents blood loss. Anytime you have a rupture in a blood vessel wall, you're going to have bleeding, obviously. The first thing that's going to happen, the arteries are going to constrict, and hopefully in the first instance, that reduction in blood flow to the site will reduce the amount of bleeding. The second thing that's going to happen here is the platelets will become sticky and they'll start to clump together. You can see that actually occurring here. We've got these little platelets starting to bind some of these red blood cells together. Eventually, the blood is going to coagulate, so it's going to clot. There are complex chemical reactions that occur, but eventually a scab will form. And these fibers, we call them fibrin, will actually start to intertwine and bind the platelets, the red blood cells together. And like a fishing net, so to speak, it'll actually start to bind up all of those cells into a scab eventually. New tissues will grow and permanently heal the wound, but you can think of these platelets basically forming a scab or a plug in the broken blood vessel wall. So that's the end of the lesson on the components of blood. And remember, if we go back to our learning intentions, what you should be able to do by now is identify the plasma, the cellular components. You should be able to identify the different types of blood cells and their function. You should be able to explain what the plasma is and the substances and chemicals that are carried via the plasma. On top of that, you should be able to talk about platelets, which we've just gone through now, and talk about how platelets play a role in the clotting of blood.